Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of Stafford Connect podcast. I'm Tom Cohen. First, I wanted to say how glad I am to be kicking off this new podcast. For me, there's nothing as exciting as sitting down with folks in our Stafford community to talk about what's going on here. Former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, once said that all politics is local, and I agree with him. At Student Government Day last week, I stressed how what happens locally directly impacts our lives. And that's why I started this program, to engage in meaningful conversations about Stafford County. And tonight, I'd like to begin with a conversation about a topic that really defines what a community is: the budget and taxes. Every year, your leaders and policymakers sit down and work out a budget for the upcoming year. Many see the budget-making process as sort of a boring exercise in pushing numbers around on a piece of paper. But if you stop to think about it, you realize it's not just all about numbers. These numbers represent something real and impacts the lives of Stafford County. The school budget or the fire and rescue budget, for example, aren't just a bunch of figures that show how much money a department wants to spend next year. It's a way to quantify all the services and programs and materials required to actually meet the need of the public. So a conversation about budgets is really about living, breathing people who need to be educated, need to be protected, and what's needed to accomplish that. It's not really just about numbers with a lot of zeros on a spreadsheet. So that means that a budget is a way of representing what a community is and wants to be going forward. That being said, maybe a good place to start in talking about the budget is to see the connection between budget speak and people's lives. So tonight, I'm inviting the Stafford County Commissioner of Revenue to sit with me and help us understand the budget and its purpose. For those of you unfamiliar with our Commissioner of Revenue, his name is Scott Mayausky. Scott was elected Commissioner in 1999 and serves for a 4-year term. Good evening, Scott, and welcome to Stafford Connect.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate your having me.
So a little bit of background. I thought we'd get things started by giving you a chance to introduce yourself to the Stafford community. You've run for office several times, but many times people are focused on the other offices and not so much on yours. So as a Commissioner of Revenue, what would you like people to know about you?
Yeah, the first thing I'd like people to know is I am a longtime Stafford County resident. I grew up off 610. My parents moved here in the early 70s, so I've been a resident of this county for nearly 50 years. It is my home. Graduated from North Stafford High School and came back after college and wanted to serve my community. So I got a job in the Commissioner of Revenue's office as a real estate appraiser when I was 23 years old, working for the legendary George Gordon, who was a commissioner for 58 years, which is the longest serving elected official in the history of the Commonwealth. He decided not to run for re-election, and in 1999, at the tender age of 26, I got elected. And I'm now serving in my 7th term as commissioner.
Wow. I mean, you said you were from 610. You've seen a lot of change on 610.
Yeah. I remember as a child, there wasn't a single stoplight on 610, and there was nothing but an Exxon and a Kentucky Fried Chicken at the 610 exit. We had to go to Woodbridge to grocery shop because there was nothing on 610 but farms.
Wow. And you said you went to college?
I did. That might surprise a lot of people, but I did. I went to, graduated from West Virginia University with a degree in history. And after that, like I said, I came home. And then when I was serving as commissioner, I went to graduate school up in D.C. at Johns Hopkins. So I have a master's degree in government.
Very impressive. All right. Since we're talking about background, often there's a sort of a conflict or a debate about which is more important when people are running for office, their views on the issues or their background of the candidates. So, and this is just sort of a theoretical fight, but those are always fun.
Yeah.
So do you have a preference or which side you lean on?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And the reason why I got involved in politics is because I like solving problems. And growing up, I always noticed that politicians were wrestling with big issues. So I gravitate towards the background, and ideas are more important than personality, but it's pretty clear that voters are drawn to personality. Having studied history and government, and You learn quickly about the 1960 Nixon and Kennedy debate, where everybody listened on the radio thought Nixon won, and everybody watched on TV thought Kennedy won. So that tells you right there that voters are more drawn to the personality than they are typically the ideas. But for me, I like listening to the ideas. I want to know who's going to solve the problems that really impact Americans, Virginians, Staffordians every day. And that's usually who I support.
Cool. And I guess sort of that if people are listening to this podcast, they'll think one way, but if they watch it on YouTube, they're going to think a different way.
I don't know.
I'll just make sure I don't start sweating. All right. So let's talk a little bit about your job as commissioner. I really much doubt that most people in the world know what a commissioner of revenue does. So what does the commissioner do?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
I'm trying.
I still get emails from people within the building where I've worked for 30 years saying, since you collect taxes, we thought you might be able to help us with that. Well, I don't collect taxes. The commissioner and the treasurer are two separate offices. My office is basically the tax assessment office. So we identify who owns what property, figure out what that property is worth. Then we wait for the Board of Supervisors to set a tax rate. We calculate how much the taxpayer owes. And that's where my job ends. Once we make that calculation, we give that to the treasurer. The treasurer is the one who mails the bills, collects and invests the money. Legally, I can't touch money. So the title's very deceiving. Florida has a very similar elected position. It's called a property appraiser. That's not as fancy a title, but it is more accurate to what we do. We are simply real estate and personal property appraisers.
All right. And since you've held this position for a number of years now, how has the position changed over the years?
Oh, it's changed dramatically. The biggest change of the position isn't so much the population growth, it's the internet. And I'm so old that when I started in the office, the internet wasn't really a thing yet. So people didn't have access to state laws. They didn't have access to assessment data, to their own assessment data they didn't have access to. So watching all of that become public and it become part of the public discussion, which it had never been before, it was a huge culture shift. And everybody was worried to put their assessments online. I remember this debate back 25 years ago, and we were afraid that it would lead to, a property tax revolt like they had in California in the 80s. But it didn't. It had the reverse effect. Most people just want information. They want to know what their property's worth, how we arrived at that value. They want to be able to see their neighbors, what's happening in their neighborhood and in their community. And as long as you're doing a good job and they trust you, providing them access to that information helped our job. And it made our job easier in the end. 20 years ago, when we had a reassessment with half the number of parcels we have today, we'd have 500 or 600 people appeal their assessments. This year, we only had 100 people appeal their assessments. And I think part of that is, one, we do a good job and we try and educate folks, but they also have access to information that they didn't have before. And I think that gives them a comfort level.
Awesome. All right. So before we get into your area, which is getting that revenue or those assessments, let's just look at the budget in general. This Board of Supervisors approved their budget and the tax rates at their April 2nd meeting a couple nights ago. But how, in general, is revenue generated for the budget in Stafford County, so that a broad swipe so that people understand it?
Yeah, there's a lot of different revenue streams, but by far the largest is the property tax. And that's what we do. We generate the property tax revenue. So about 70% of all local tax revenue generated in Stafford is generated in my office. That is roughly $300 million, over $300 million when you combine the real estate tax, which is by far the largest source. Then the second largest source is the car tax, the much hated car tax. That generates about $70 million. So Those two combined is where most of our local tax revenue is coming. Then there's also state money and some federal money that, that comes in as well.
And do we receive a lot of state and federal funds? I know in the school bailiwick, they get a fair amount of state funds, but federal funds are very limited.
Yeah. Yeah, I think most people would be surprised. I don't have a number, but most people would be surprised how little federal money we get. And it feels like it's a bigger number than it is, because in local government where you have to balance a budget, every dollar counts. I know you know this because you were on the board. So the feds can only give us, if they're only giving us a little bit of money, it's still precious, because every dollar we get from them is a dollar we don't have to go and get from the taxpayer. So, we take care to get as much money and grant money as we can from the federal government. But in the grand scheme of things, it's minimal compared to what we get from the citizens here in Stafford County.
So what is the relationship between sort of our spending plan or our budget and then what we think about the future? I know we have, and the public may well know this, we have their plan for the future, their CIP for the future, our 20-year or 50-year plan. We try to do a 5-year budget plan, but how much really does every year it mesh with that type of planning?
Yeah, the long-term budgeting and planning documents are helpful to guide the board and the community. But at the end of the day, most of what I see is boards trying to solve the immediate problem in front of them. If the schools are lacking funding, or if there's a transportation issue that's hot, well, you can't tell the citizens, sorry, that's not in our long range plan until 2030. So there's a lot of moving things around, and unfortunately that comes at the expense of the long-term planning. But there's so many immediate needs that we have here in Stafford County. It's really hard to make a long-range plan and stick to it, because something always comes up that needs to be addressed immediately.
And if people could sort of relate to that to their own families, because you could sit there and say, I have a long-term plan to do X, Y, and Z, but then you have a problem with your roof, or you have a problem with sewer backing up, or health issues or something. So it's similar to what real people deal with.
Yeah, I mentioned I graduated from West Virginia University, so I think very simplistically. And I know a lot of folks don't like comparing public finance and large budgets to their household budget, but the principles are the same. What you just described is no different than a school needing emergency repairs, which may not have been budgeted for, may not have been planned for, may not be in the CIP, but you have to do it. And you have to do it immediately. And again, since we can't go borrow money like the federal government, at that moment, when you have to fund that unintended expense, you've got to make priority decisions. And you've got to cut things out and delay things that you didn't want to. So it is very similar to a household budget.
All right. So again, talking about expenditures, what would you identify as the main areas that we expended or spend money on in Stafford County?
I saw a chart floating around Facebook that broke down spending for the past 14 years. And I was very surprised. Obviously, public safety was a huge driver between the sheriff's department and fire and rescue. But like the next highest growth in terms of percentage, you had non-revenue generating, non-public safety offices like IT and HR and community engagement. The schools were down at the bottom of the list, quite frankly, with me and the treasurer's office, and a few others that didn't have that growth trajectory that some of the other offices did. So, I found that interesting. I hope that some of the board members saw that as well, because it's not that there's anything wrong with funding these offices. Just it might be time to shift priorities now and focus on some of the other aspects in the budget that maybe have been underfunded over the years. I tend to look at budgets, not only like household budgets, but I try and put myself in the place of a business. And I think, okay, if I'm a business that needs revenue, which Stafford County needs revenue, where would a business put their money? Well, they'd probably put their money in research and development and sales, which in Stafford County, that translates to your revenue generating offices, and your highest priority, which most people would say is the school system, is right up there with public safety.
And earlier you were talking about how things pop up. And I remember when I was on the board, we had, in Baltimore, for example, had the somebody hacked into their system and threatened to release information if they didn't cough up a chunk of money. So a lot of communities, including Stafford, that's why we went to IT, was to prevent us from having sort of that blackmail thing thrown up at us.
Yeah,
I think
ransomware stuff.
Yeah, ransomware.
Yeah.
And I think Baltimore actually paid for it because it was either pay up or else this. And they just so a lot of communities just sort of popped up at the last minute and said, okay, we're throwing money to IT solely to protect the long term, which is sort of an interesting, it just keeps going back to what we've been saying.
Yeah.
All right. So now we go to weird, nice governmental terms. But when you're looking at the budget, is there anything that's sort of either mandatory spending or direct spending, or things that we have to spend money on versus discretionary spending that we have a little bit more say over?
Yeah, there's a lot more discretionary spending at the local level than there is certainly at the federal level and even the state level. We get money from the state for social services, public safety, education that has to be spent in those areas. But most of our local money is discretionary, which is why you see so much conflict during budget time. There's a finite pot of money that can be divvied up, and everybody's fighting for their priorities. They're fighting to get attention because they want money going to their priorities. So most of our local money is discretionary.
All right. And so is there a certain percentage, or it sort of goes year to year, sort of depending on what we've decided to take from the federal government or the state that has strings attached?
Yeah, I think it shifts year to year depending upon the priorities of the board. And I think Virginia even has more discretionary spending than other states. Most states, the property tax, the real estate tax, is dedicated to the public schools. And that doesn't happen here in Virginia. That giant pot of money goes into the general fund, and then we all start fighting over how to spend it. So I don't know that I have any statistics to back it up, but it seems like we have a larger discretionary pot of money than most states do. And again, I think that leads to a lot of the discussion, the healthy discussion that we have over priorities.
And anybody who follows sort of the people on the board, we won't even say, I'll just go back many, many boards. People come in and they have certain priorities. So depending on who's on the board and the interconnection between them, it might be, person X is really into Parks and Rec. And so for a while that their goal is Parks and Rec. And so they spend a lot of money and put a lot of money into parks. And then you may have a shift of who's in, and it shifts over to schools or shifts over to fire and rescue or law enforcement. And so it goes back to what you're saying is there's, an overarching view, yes, but type situation.
Yeah, that's right. I think people not involved in local government and who are more focused on federal government would be surprised at the impact that one or two or a handful of people can have. And you mentioned board members, but even non-board members, I'm sure you know this well, they've moved the discussion just by their persistence, by them using their voice. So yes, there's a constant movement and shifting of priorities depending upon who's in the board and who in the community is actively engaged.
All right, so a term that's often brought up is unfunded mandates. And so is Stafford sort of forced by those? Unfunded mandates, for those of you who are not obsessed with these things, can be something that the feds tell us or that the states tell us that we have to do. So do we have a lot of...
There are a lot. And Most of what I'm exposed to comes from the state level. The state will pass a tax exemption or some requirement that sounds great and looks wonderful on their campaign brochure, and then we're left holding the bag and paying the bill. Those are the unfunded mandates that you're talking about, and they're very difficult for us to fund because we've already got all these other competing priorities. And then right in the middle of that, the state will come in sometimes and drop their priority, which they're requiring to be funded, in the middle of ours. And then you're left with the question of either raising taxes or cutting back on our own and refocusing our own priorities, because now we have to satisfy the state requirement.
And one of the former presidents in his reelection, was very proud of the fact that he put 10,000 more police on the street. But the way it got through Congress was Congress didn't give any money for it. And so it all had to be paid for by the local government, which is sort of that unfunded mandate aspect of it, is that you have to do it. And there's sort of a hybrid now where, it used to be funded mandates, unfunded mandates, but now there's this sort of middle thing where we'll pay you for X number of years, but then you have to commit to do it for X plus more years.
Yeah, that actually came up at the budget meeting on Tuesday with the SAFER grant for public safety, where the federal government will fund public safety officers for, I believe it's 2 years, but then after that 2 years, then they become county employees, and we have to fund all of that. So that's that hybrid kind of mandate that you're talking about, and it's very real. We've taken on a number of those positions in the past, and it's great until the federal money runs out, and then you've got to find local money to pay for it. And again, it comes from either readjusting priorities or raising taxes.
And I remember from watching that session, because I don't have a life, I was watching it from home, and with the schools also, where they were asking about why they did it, a certain one, and it was that we had money during COVID, and we were required do it so many years after. Well, now the time's up, and we either have to make that decision of keep funding it or wiping out these positions, which are actually doing something in our system. And the same is with the SAFER grant, and the same with other ones, that it puts the county and states into a sort of weird situation of, you look horrible if you don't take the money, but you're committing extra years to it that sometimes does not get expressed in the media.
Yeah. We're all yelling for resources, and the federal government or the state will put some in front of us, but not everybody sees the strings that are attached to them, right? So it doesn't necessarily make sense why we don't grab it and run. Well, because we know 3 or 4 years down the road, everybody's is going to have to pay for those resources. It is a balancing act.
It is. It's really good. All right, so let's move to your wheelhouse and revenues. So what is the main? You've said that the main source of it is the property tax and real estate tax, and so I'm going to, as often as possible, make sure that we say real estate versus property,
okay, because
almost everybody I know, when you start saying property tax, slides into the car tax, but they're two different things.
Very different things. And the vast majority, about 50% of our local revenue, comes from the real estate tax. The other 20 comes primarily through the car tax. So the real estate tax is the big driver. And for the first time ever, the value of the entire county is over $28 billion. It had dropped to around $12 billion after the 2008 reassessment, and we've slowly been creeping back up, but we're now at a record $28 billion in value.
Wow. So I guess what impact can the policymakers have on the county's revenue stream? And I guess we'll start with the real estate tax, but then if we can go to a broader picture of, okay, this is why, in theory, that we're looking for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, they can have a huge impact. Stafford County is overwhelmingly residential, even more so than Spotsylvania. We always have been. I'm not quite sure why, but that's always been the case. So one of the things the boards have been trying to do is create a business-friendly climate. And that with the hope that we're going to get businesses here, and that the more businesses we have, the less money we'll have to get from the residents. And it's a slow process, but it's working. Our commercial property increased by 23% this last reassessment, which is huge. Residential went up 13%. And typically in a rising market, residential always outpaces commercial, but this time it didn't. So to me, that was a clear sign that whatever we're doing, whether we like the distribution facilities or not, these large-scale businesses are contributing to the tax base, and they're easing some of the burden on the residential property owners.
And I don't want to put you on a spot on this thing, but for years we've heard that for every home that's built, for every dollar they bring in, they bring $1 plus in expenses. Whereas a business, if every dollar they bring in taxes, it's less than $1 that's in expenses. Is that still basically true?
It is. And the way I think of it, again, I think very simplistically, the cost to educate one's child in school, the local cost is about $5,500, and the average tax bill is about $4,000, real estate tax bill. So you can see right there, a family with 2 kids in school, there's $11,000 worth of expenses and $4,000 to pay for it. So that's not even talking about Parks and Rec and transportation and all the other expenses. So yeah, I definitely think that is still true. So we've got to continue to focus on building our commercial tax base, because that's the best protection we can offer for residential homeowners.
And is there a certain, broadly, theoretically speaking, certain type of business that we should be looking at versus other ones that we shouldn't be? Or is it sort of, because we get this from people all the time. Why are we still getting this type of business on this road, which is the 17th of them within a 2-mile radius, and why are we doing it? But then there's the question of, are the other ones even coming or wanting to come?
Yeah, I think it's important for people to remember that we still have a free market, and these businesses are making business decisions. So if there are 2 Starbucks within a baseball's throw of each other, we didn't go out and recruit them. They have economists and they have developers who have decided on their own that this is the best business model for them. And there's really nothing we can do to prevent that. But I think the broader picture is, it's nice having the large Fortune 500 companies who might, stroke $500,000 tax check every year. But we need a healthy mix of everything. I'd love to see more mom and pop stores. We were just talking about Curtis Grocery this morning in the office, and those types of businesses are going away the more expensive Stafford County becomes. But I'd like to see a healthier mix of, not just the big companies, but also the small ones, because that's really what the community's about. The Amazon vans driving up and down 610, they're generating us money, but it doesn't really build that sense of community the way a Curtis Grocery does when they sponsor, a Little League team or a Taylor's Grocery. Some of those smaller companies, they really feed into the community, and you need a mix of both to have a healthy, vibrant community.
And you were saying that it's sort of the market size. I heard yesterday on the news that the very last Boston market is set to close, and that's up in either New Jersey or in Boston area. That they used to have them all across. We even had them in Northern Virginia, and now they're down to one store, because in a way people's tastes have changed, people's desires have changed, what they want to eat, how they want to do things. Growing up, I still have a hard time fathoming a drive-through donut shop or a drive-through Chinese restaurant. But to other people, it is just normal. And it's just really how our society has sort of changed how it do it.
Yep. Yeah, the market changes, and we have nothing to do with that. In a free market, businesses are going to come and they're going to go. But what people forget is those changes are driven by their preferences. I remember having a conversation with somebody years ago who was upset that we didn't have more brick and mortar storefront stores because they like just going and shopping and window shopping. And then they proceeded to tell me how much they love Amazon's delivery, and that's where they get most of their groceries and clothes. I'm like, well, you realize by going online, that's why there are no brick and mortar stores. So at the bottom of this growth and these businesses that people want or don't want are personal choices. And their personal choices are driving what is coming, whether they realize it or not.
Right. It's really, I mean, I was thinking the other day when my mother was alive, we used to go to Spotsy Mall, or town center, once every 2 months. And we'd walk through the mall, and we haven't, even before she started fading, we had stopped doing that because she would like buying stuff on Amazon. And now that she's gone, I haven't been to the mall since, just because it's just not someplace I go, because I just go to Amazon or I go to some other place online. It's really a difference. So people are familiar with the real estate tax, but can you walk us through how it sort of works? So, because we do it every 2 years, we do an assessment, which seems to be the norm. So sort of walk us through what happens, how, if my house is going to be looked at, what's the call in the process?
It's all driven by sales. It's a different but similar process to a bank appraisal. So if you bought a house or refinanced, your bank probably sent out an appraiser to figure out what your house is worth. The values at the end of the day are similar, but the processes are different. And one key difference is we're responsible for equity. So we have to determine not only what the property's worth, but we have to figure out what every similar property to it is worth. And that takes a lot of statistical analysis. So we'll try and collect all the sales that happen in your neighborhood, and we'll get down to your specific house type. But then we'll also look at the same house type in similar neighborhoods, because we've got to make sure they're all assessed the same so we're not discriminating against anybody. So it starts with the sales. We break the county up into neighborhoods. We've broken it up into about 550 different neighborhoods, and they can be traditional neighborhoods like yours, or by neighborhood, it can just be similar house types in a similar region. So once we break it up into those neighborhoods, then we look for sales within those neighborhoods, and we try and identify what's driving difference in prices. And we'll make adjustments accordingly in our database once we identify those key differences. And we'll review sales all the way up through the end of the year. So you said we're on a 2-year cycle. So we just finished the reassessment. Our values are good for 1 day. That's all appraisals are good for 1 day because the market immediately moves the next day. So the values are good as of January 1, 2024 in this case, and we'll look at sales all the way up to that date. If there's any last minute trends, we've got a powerful enough software system that we can make large scale adjustments to either pull back or increase values to match the market. Once we do that, we send out reassessment notices and we encourage folks to come in and appeal. Most folks, or a lot of folks, just want to know the process. And we can walk them through the process, show them data, and they usually feel better about that. We're open, we show them what we do and explain to them what we do, and most folks are satisfied with that. And we learn a lot. We don't know everything about every property. And this is our one chance to get it right because that value sticks for 2 years. So we'll learn a lot from folks. Say, well, that field doesn't perk. Here's a non-perk. Or I don't have a finished basement and you thought I did. So we'll make adjustments. We change about 40% of the values of people that appeal.
So just so everybody's sort of on the same page, perking. I know what perking is, but I would suppose that not everybody knows what perk means.
So if you live in a rural part of the county and don't have public water or public sewer, you have to build your own drain field. And basically you're pumping that wastewater into a field, and the ground has to be absorbent enough to absorb that wastewater. Unfortunately, we have a lot of red clay in Stafford County, So perking is very important and necessary to do because red clay doesn't absorb water as much as nice loamy soil does. So a soil scientist will come out if you're buying a lot and want to build a house, and they will do tests to see how absorbent the soil is. It'll either perk, which means it will absorb the water and you can build a drain field, or it won't perk, which means the water would just sit there on the surface level and then you won't get a permit to build your house.
So, I was going to make a horrible joke, but I won't. And by and large, it's pretty safe to say the land east of 95 is not really well known for perking, but west of 95 has that better soil.
Yes.
Just by chance, that it ended up being that
Yeah.
way. The assessments in Stafford seem to go up very high this go around. So why would that have happened? I think I saw in the paper where condos and townhomes went up 13%. I think I saw in the paper.
Yeah. The total for all classes was 13%. It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Interest rates are high, so you would expect values to go down, but they're not. And part of that is because the market and supply and demand still drives the market, and there's a very low supply of houses and a very high demand. And I heard a term that I'd never heard before about a month ago called the golden mortgage. And the golden mortgage is similar to the golden handcuffs that people have when they near retirement. They can't go anywhere because they've got that pension waiting for them, so they're stuck. People with these mortgages that are 2 and 3%, they don't want to come off of them. They don't want to sell their house with their golden mortgage and then go get a 5, 6, 7% mortgage in another house. So they're staying put, and that is lowering the supply, which is driving up the value of the houses. It seems to me, if that's really the dynamic that's at play, that once interest rates, if they return to 2 and 3%, then you could see a flood of houses on the market, and that could either stop this growth of values or even reduce values a little bit. But that's just idle speculation on my part.
Right. Well, to a certain degree, when my mom was passing, she was like, "Are you still going to live in this house?" And I said yes. And then after she passed, and I looked at what my mortgage is now versus getting anything else, it was exactly that. I'm in a very nice position. Versus if I tried to get anything else, then it'd be even a smaller, tinier house would be paying more a month. So I think you're right. One of the things that comes up often from people is, you get your mortgage, and you pay your taxes in your mortgage like myself. But if you've already paid off your home, you're hit with it in June and December, which is, December holiday season. And so people always ask me, why can't we shift that to do it March and September or something else? But when I was listening to you at one of the budget sessions, you explained why that's really problematic.
Yeah. You can go to once a year billing, but October is the month when you have to send out the bill. And getting to that point is where the problem comes in. You're going to end up with a revenue shortfall for one of the 6-month period. You're either going to have to overtax people for 1 6-month period, and the county would have a big windfall, or you'd have to undertax them and skip a 6-month cycle to get to that October date. One of the ways to deal with that, though, and I think the new treasurer, Mike Sinkowski, is very open to this, is allowing folks to set up monthly installments. So even your car tax, one of the reasons people hate the car tax so much is because they can't escrow it. They have to write that check twice a year. Whereas your home, where the bill is much bigger, you don't really feel it because most people have mortgages as part of the mortgage. This would allow folks to pay that monthly payment so it wouldn't feel as painful at the end of the year right before Christmas or even in October. Then you're not going to get 2 big bills. You're going to get one gigantic bill.
Right.
So that it takes away the Christmas aspect, but it doesn't really help folks if they're stretched for money. But allowing them to stretch those payments out, that would go a long way to helping solve that problem.
And that's an interesting idea. I hadn't heard that one before. But I'm going to jump ahead and then I'll go back. But I often tell my students when I'm talking about taxes and we talk about real estate taxes that the board may set the rate in April, or if it's the legislature's doing its wonders in May. But the tax is actually backdated to January. So like last year, there was this windfall of, I forget how many millions of dollars, 6 million, I think, of money that we were sitting there because even though we passed the budget in April, the tax was actually backdated to January so that when people receive their bill at the end of the year, it's actually backdated for several months. So couldn't that help with that time frame aspect?
It could, but we don't have the ability to change that date. January 1st is called tax day in Virginia, and everything revolves around that date. All my assessments revolve around that date. The tax rate, as you said, gets backdated to that date. Now, there are localities that have gone to a fiscal tax year, but it's still kind of the same thing. It's still that one point in time where everything revolves around in terms of taxes.
No, what I'm sort of saying is that if you made it March, then you would have that X amount of money. We'll say $3 million out of the $6 million, $3 million, because you said if we try to change it, then we'll have a time period where we are short.
Yeah.
But if we know we're getting that money, couldn't we do it that way? That's what I'm sort of trying to figure out. If there's a way.
I don't. There's nothing in the code that allows you to go to anything other than January 1st or July 1st.
Okay.
And with the fiscal years, that really makes it challenging.
So what would be the process? You said that if people have an issue with it, they can communicate and try to contest it.
Yeah.
So what's the normal process?
So when we send out our notices, we have directions on the notice how to go online and file an appeal, or it's as simple as just calling us up. We always have appraisers available. I am an appraiser. I talk to folks whenever I have people out in the field and folks need help, or you can come into the office and talk to us. The official appeal period's closed, but we don't turn anybody away. Let me walk you through the formal appeal process. So when you call us or come in and talk to us, that's called an in-house appeal. That's where you meet with me or one of my appraisers and we explain to you what we did. If you're not satisfied with that, there's something called the Board of Equalization. The Board of Equalization is a 3-person panel that is appointed by the circuit court. And they have the power to change any and all of our assessments. So if you don't like what we did after you met with us, you can then appeal to the Board of Equalization. And it's kind of cool to watch. It's very much like a legal hearing. We'll have it in the board chambers, and they'll sit at the dais, and the taxpayer will present their case. Our appraiser will present their case. And then the BOE will go behind closed doors, and they'll rule. The next step after that is circuit court. We don't get a lot of lawsuits, but that's the end of the appeal line is circuit court.
And generally speaking, one of the lines I've heard people say in the past is, their appraisal is here, but if they went and tried to sell their house, it would be higher.
Yeah.
So therefore, if you really want, and the people will complain that their appraisal is too high, and it's like, okay, I'll buy your house for that. I mean, because it's actually less than what you would get if you sold it on the open market.
Yeah, our target number is 92% of market value. And there's a reason for that. Since we're doing statistical analysis, if you're at 92% of market value, then you're probably not over 100%. There's coefficient of dispersion, which measures how far above the average you are and how far below the average you are. Our coefficient of dispersion is usually 7 or 8%, which means most of our assessments are then falling between 99% and 85 or 86%. So we're not over assessing the county at that point. If we were to push the average value to 98% of the market, well, that means that you're over assessing about half the county, and nobody wants that. So yes, we are typically a little bit lower than what things sell for.
And one of the many things that you have sort of championed over the years to try to do more tax relief for elderly people.
Yes, I've worked very closely with you on a number of those issues. And I think in your district, when you were supervisor of the GW district, and I see it every day, the people who can't pay the taxes, and a lot of them are elderly folks. They're people in White Oak who have inherited a little bit of land, and now that land is valuable because of all the development, and they're struggling to pay those tax bills. And a lot of folks don't see them. And when you're focused on the schools and you work up north and you commute and you don't really go south of the courthouse, you don't realize how many people there are in this community that need help. And it isn't just the elderly, but we don't have the tools to help anybody other than the elderly. So yeah, we've talked a lot about needing to expand that program. But it all comes back to priorities. I know you were frustrated by not being able to get a lot of the relief that you wanted, and it just comes down to priorities. There's only so many dollars.
Well, and interesting because some of those people that we're talking about, either the elderly or others, they will have or may have already paid off their house, so that's not part of their mortgage. So they will get those bills twice a year. That sort of hits them with this big amount of money that they have to pay. So it's a really an interesting dynamic because. There's so many people that are not seen by a lot of people. And it just really is an interesting element. I mean, the number of people who are living in hotels that, they're in a room, like a whole family in a hotel room because they can't afford an apartment, a down payment stuff.
Yeah.
It's just really an interesting element.
Yeah. And I think some of that's a function of how fast the county grew.
This is back to a more philosophical argument or a question. The real estate tax was sort of created many centuries ago because most people's wealth was in estates. And I read this in a book about the London Fire in the 1500s. And that's where the term came from, which was really interesting. But nowadays, most people's wealth is on income, not on the amount of land they have. So is there an interesting dichotomy or discussion that could be held about should we be shifting from basing everything on a real estate tax and moving to something else?
Yeah. So the real estate tax is about a 6,000-year-old tax, and it dates back to ancient Egyptian times. And interestingly, it's administered almost the exact same way. Only back then they took scrolls out that they were given to them by the pharaoh to tax people, and now we just take laptops out and we identify who owns what and we tax them. It really hasn't changed all that much. But what has changed that you hit on is land then was wealth. You didn't just have land. You had it because you were growing crops, and those crops in a barter system, that was money. So it was wealth. The more land you had, the more wealthy you were, so the more you should pay in taxes. So in essence, back then, it was a property, or it was an income tax, because income was just different then than it is today. Yes, it's a very difficult tax. It's very regressive. It doesn't really fit in modern times, and quite frankly, it doesn't really fit in a county like Stafford, where until very recently you had many high-income earners living in modest homes. And we hear this all the time at the board meetings. We're top 20 in the nation in income. Why don't we have more money for schools? Well, it's because we can't tax the income. We're stuck with the property tax. And you've got to balance the people with the high income with the folks we talked about who don't have the money to pay. They're all paying the same tax rate. So we have to try and find that balance. But I don't know that a local income, as much as it would help Stafford, I don't know that it's sustainable because the federal government's taxing income and the state government's taxing income, and to add a local on top of that, at some point you start to hurt the productivity. You start hurting productivity, and that is a drain on the economy. So in my opinion, until the federal government moves away from the income tax and goes to more of a consumption-based tax or whatever they come up with next, I don't think that localities can get to that income, because it'll just be too much of a burden on folks. But it is a self-regulating tax. And what I mean by that is, if you lose your job and you can't afford to pay taxes, on an income tax, your tax liability drops. That property tax bill doesn't care if you have a job or not. It's coming and it needs to be paid. So an income tax would be more fair at the local level.
Awesome. Well, and I've heard that discussion for over a quarter century, so it's sort of an interesting theoretical discussion, which I sort of like. So now we'll go to the ever popular car tax / personal property tax. Loads of people have run on the idea of let's eliminate it, but it never gets eliminated. Why? Why is it that is such a hard nut to crack?
Yeah, it's because it's a local tax, and as I said, it's our second highest source of revenue. We don't really have a way locally to replace it other than the real estate tax. And the difference between the car tax and the real estate tax is only paid by people who own property or renters. The car tax hits a much broader base. So you're not just getting all your revenue from one small base, you're getting it from a much broader base. And there's this theory called the basket of taxes. You want a bunch of different taxes in your basket because it protects your revenue, it protects your budget. If one segment of the economy goes into a recession or drops, then you theoretically have a bunch of other pieces in there that can support that so that your whole budget doesn't crash. If you put all your eggs in the real estate basket, then like I said, you have a smaller pool of people who are paying it. And if anything happens to that market, well, now your budget's in real jeopardy because you don't have any supporting taxes to back it up. Richmond, obviously, with Governor Gilmore, tried to eliminate the tax and reimburse the localities, and they simply found it was too expensive. In 2005 dollars, $1 billion was sent from Richmond back to localities, and that only covered 70% of the car tax bills. Now we're talking multiple billions of dollars, and Richmond just doesn't have it. But they also know they can't just come and decimate localities' budgets and by mandating that the car tax go away, unless they give us something to replace it, and nobody's been able to come up with that yet.
Right. Interesting. So let's move to the data centers issue. That's big. And you've been saying in other interviews, in other formats, that data centers will be a game changer for the county as far as generating revenue. So how would that work and why?
It's almost staggering how much revenue data centers generate. And it all goes back to the property tax. These are large industrial buildings, but the real value of the data center is the equipment in the building. The buildings will be worth $40, $50, $60 million, but they could have $1 billion worth of taxable computer equipment in them. And that is staggering. That alone generates $5-6 million per building. So you have something like a 500-acre campus with 25 buildings on it, each building generating $5 to $6 million. That is an unbelievable revenue stream for the county. It was estimated that campus, the 500-acre campus, when it's fully built out, will generate about 120 million tax dollars. Well, our car tax revenue generates about 70 million, to put it in perspective. And that's one campus. So if you have multiple campuses, it is a tremendous opportunity for the county to either, invest in schools or roads, infrastructure, and or provide tax relief. So it's a tremendous opportunity, but it's very challenging. With taxation, the more revenue you generate from an entity, the more complex that entity is. So you can imagine how complex taxing these data centers are. I tell folks, the more I get into it, it's like peeling back an onion and finding a Rubik's Cube in it. So we're going to be studying these things for the next 12, 18 months to make sure that when the first one opens, we are ready to go so that we can maximize the revenue we generate from them. Otherwise, every dollar we don't get from them has got to come from a taxpayer. So we're going to be fair to the data centers, and I think they know that. We've had lots of conversations with them, but we're going to be accurate, and we're going to try and generate the appropriate amount of tax revenue from them because we have to. I owe that to my constituents.
Well, I noticed in the budget work sessions that was one of the things that you were trying to do is get staffing sort of on board to be ready to go when it hits the ground and it starts happening.
Yeah.
Again, being sort of proactive, which is sort of your bailiwick.
Yeah, that goes back to the long-term planning, and I did run up against some resistance, and I understand it. We're probably 18 months away from the first fully functioning data center, so it might seem a bit odd that I'm asking for people now, but I don't know that they fully grasp the complexity of these data centers. And we always try and do things within the budget calendar, and the business cycle doesn't fit within the budget calendar. So I think we arrived at an appropriate compromise that we're going to bring positions on January 1st. Of 2025. And then we'll have a 12-month run-up where we're going to be generating tax revenue through the real estate tax. We already are now. But we're going to continue to generate that. And then by the time those things open, we're going to be fully trained and we're going to be ready to go so that we can not only generate that revenue, but you also need to protect that revenue. It's very complicated to the point where sometimes the data centers don't even know how to file. And that can actually boomerang back on the county and create a liability for us. If they file on a bunch of property that is not taxable accidentally, then they can come back at any point and ask for a refund with 10%. That's perfectly legal. And it's happened to us before, and we've got to prevent that from happening now because the stakes are just too high.
Right, and it's happened before, but not with data centers.
But not with data centers.
I'm not going to ask who. But wanted to make sure people knew that it wasn't.
Yeah, not with data centers. No.
One of the other issues that you have sort of been in the forefront of addressing was the Virginia constitutional amendment that dealt with veterans, and how it impacted localities. And Stafford and I and you, we love our veterans. But there was sort of this law of unintended consequences that people didn't see, which often happens with any type of decision or, policy making or anything.
Yeah.
But so sort of walk us through what that was and then what the efforts in the state have been to sort of address this issue.
Yeah, so in 2011, there was a constitutional amendment that I voted for that exempted 100% disabled veterans, service-related disability, from paying real estate taxes. Part of the problem with this was the General Assembly, when they were debating this constitutional amendment, were given some misinformation, not intentional, that there were only about 500 or 600 veterans in the entire state. So a lot of us thought, okay, well, we can absorb, 10, 20, 100 veterans in our community. Well, the number today is over 3,000 in Stafford County, and it's over 17 million tax dollars. I've been trying for years to get the state to recognize that this is a joint responsibility. That, yes, it's a great program. If it came up again, I'd vote for it again. But the state needs to partner with localities so that, one, we're not getting hit as hard as we are in terms of funding the program. But two, I think that also protects the program and the veterans themselves. My fear is this becomes such a burden on localities. that you're going to have localities trying to find ways to scale it back or eliminate it. And that's not fair to anybody. So I've been trying to convince the state that, hey, let's share this burden together, because we all benefited from their actions. They're not Stafford County's veterans. They're all of our veterans. They served for all of us, not just Stafford County. There's been lots of conversation and lots of committee meetings, but no action yet. But we're hopeful that at some point they'll recognize that and send some money back to the county to help offset that cost.
And it's sort of on the same wavelength as car tax issue, where the mindset is we can do X, but when you get into nuts and bolts, there's far more to it than just get rid of it and that's okay.
Yeah. And you hear that from a lot of folks who don't really know the budget and the revenue streams and local finances the way we do. And it does seem simple. Just get rid of it and we can cut here and cut there and tighten our belts and pay for it.
Oh, get rid of the car tax, by the way, you're saying.
Yes. Get rid of the car tax.
We're making that clear.
Yes.
It's sort of the same thing with the veterans issue, is that logic would say there's some way to deal with this, but then when you start getting into the nuts and bolts, it's really difficult to come up with an easy solution. So as a way of closing out, can you share with us a couple priorities that your office has going forward, and how important those are for Stafford County?
Yeah, I think the biggest priority and what we owe the citizens of Stafford County now is to get up to speed on the data centers. So as I mentioned, we're going to be learning as much as we can and studying those. And it's really one of the most interesting parts about our job is that we get to learn a little bit about every single industry that we tax. And we'll do tours of distribution facilities and we'll do tours of data centers and we'll learn how they operate, because we have to know that to make sure that they're filing correctly and we're generating the proper amount of tax revenue. So that's a priority for us, to always stay current on these emerging technologies and industries, because they're all coming to this region right now. Another challenge is we've got to look at addressing the tax relief for the disability. We've got to expand that program. There are lots of folks out there that need the help, especially with tax bills rising every single year. And we haven't changed our income and net worth limits in a very long time, probably a decade. We really need to look at that, and we need to find a program that the county can afford, but that will also help the greatest in need.
And that sort of does right back to where we started, which was you set up goals for the community, but then things pop up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's an ongoing discussion. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'd say if we had all seven supervisors here right now, they would all say, absolutely, we need to help those folks. And then something will break somewhere that they'll have to fund, and then that changes the entire discussion.
Right. And that's sort of the issue with a lot of different things. So everything comes back into a circle. So as we close up, I thought it'd be nice to have the guests sort of relay a story or a memory about Stafford that they think is special, because this is trying to connect everybody to the great things that is in Stafford County. And so,
yeah.
Is there anything in particular that comes to your mind?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories. I love music. Let me set it up. I love music, all kinds of music. I'm working one day and I get a call from somebody in our PIO's office, and they say, "You're not going to believe what I'm looking at." I said, "I'm at Government Island, and in a golf cart is Jane Connor, who's one of our esteemed historians, and Henry Rollins, who is the lead singer of the legendary punk rock band Black Flag. And they're sitting in a golf cart together, having a lovely conversation about history." So I get in my car and I drive down there. Well, first I go home and grab my guitar because I want Henry Rollins to sign my guitar. And sure enough, there they are sitting in the golf cart. And one, the juxtaposition is fabulous. But two, it just drives home the point of we have so many amazing people and things in Stafford County that we don't realize or we take for granted. I always tell folks, you never know who lives next door to you. You know, it could be the Undersecretary of Education for the United States. Like, you just don't know. And that makes this a really fun and interesting and dynamic place to live.
Cool. That's great. And I'll just do one today. My mom was born in New York City, and one of her favorite things, and she said this when when she was dying, was she loved going to Doug Sullivan's store and seeing his mom, and just having conversations. They both were on the same age, and it was like they had gone to high school together. They had been friends for their lives. Or Jerry Silver would call the house up, and she was just talking, and just the people that we have are just so welcoming and friendly, and and so that when Mom passed, one of the Newtons put on Facebook that she was a good whiteout girl. And I immediately was like, oh, I have to tell Mom she wrote this. I was like, oh, no, she knows that she wrote this. But it's just, that is what's so nice, is that you just drive through parts of Stafford and it's just so, nice and friendly. And you hear hawks and, you see cattle, and, it's just really relaxing, which I didn't get when I lived in Arlington. So, all right, well. So thank you, Scott, for your story and all your service to the community, and particularly for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and be on our first show, and adding to the conversation.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Oh, you're a font of information. We wish you the best in the future and all the work that you're doing. You do have a very tough job.
Thank you. I enjoy it, though. I enjoy it. I love helping people. I think back to when I took over. Another real quick story. George Gordon handed me his code book, and he said, "This is your Bible. You can use it to help people or to hurt people." Most people don't think of tax assessors as being able to help people, but if you want to help people, no matter what you're doing in life, you can find a way. And I'd like to think we find a way to help folks.
Well, I can say you do, because the number of people who I've interacted that would call the office and get you, or anybody in the office, and they're just like, they were so helpful and they were so nice, and they really did things to make my life better. Good. So that's great. I mean, that's really, you're right. It's with anything in government and all of our lives, you can either choose to be helpful to people or harm them, and that's the difference that we can make as humans. Okay, so I want to thank you, our audience, as well, for taking the time to join us this evening. I hope you've heard some things that will get you thinking or make you want to know more. If that's true, then I've done my job. Our next episode of Stafford Connect will land in June and help prepare us for the 4th of July. We'll sit down with representatives from the Ferry Farm Foundation and the Potomac Tribal Center, both of whom are planning big events for the 4th of July for families and history lovers. Until next time, I'm Tom Cohen, and you're listening to the Stafford Connect podcast. Stafford Connect is a River's Edge Media original podcast. You can listen to the show anywhere you get your podcast or catch the video on our YouTube channel. Stafford Connect, the conversation begins here.